So I went into filmmaking a little bit later in my late 20s, and I came from writing, and I had done a lot of profiles on people, and really it was a love of people and how interesting and complex they are. So I also had a political aim with the work that I was doing, but I really wanted to, writing articles about people, I often felt I couldn't capture something really essential about who they were. And so that led me into wanting to work in film to capture the complexity of the human being. So in 2016, I participated in the Open Immersion Lab, and what that was a project that was put together with the National Film Board, the Canadian Film Centre, and the Ford Foundation, and it was to bring together creators of color, and there are a lot of filmmakers, but there are also theater artists and people worked in different art forms. And 6 artists of color came from the American South, and 6 Indigenous filmmakers came from across Canada. And we spent time together talking about what was happening within virtual reality, but actually focusing a lot on the politics of representation, because there had been a lot of work in the VR field that was, as creators of color, pretty disturbing. Actually, it should be disturbing to anyone. So we had a conversation around how we felt about certain works, what possibilities there might be to work within VR, because it's still evolving. And then we had the chance to make prototypes. So we divided up into groups and we made 4 prototypes for virtual reality pieces that I think we did in 5 days. So it was very quick. But it was a chance to experiment with the actual technology and work with professionals from VR to try out some ideas. So Arrival was the film that, or the VR piece that several of us made, and it was very interesting. And it basically attempted to do a narrative structure, and I think it was kind of successful, but you travel on kind of a Greyhound bus with a young man who is going on a journey. And over the course of the bus ride, you discover why he's going, but you can hear his thoughts. So you're basically in his shoes as he goes through this. And we were able to put people all in the bus, and so we really replicated the idea of a long journey and people are talking to you. And so it was a really interesting project. But I think the most interesting part for all of us was the conversations and how quickly they move when everybody was kind of on the same page about representational politics in VR and filmmaking. So we kind of moved away from, what we spend a lot of our time talking about, which is what do we find problematic that's on the screen, and maybe disrespectful, or portraying people just as victims who are from, other places that you don't know so well that seem kind of exotic. And we could move to what kind of works would we really want to participate in, create, to come up with something that was generative rather than critical. Well, since I started making films, I've always done what you could call cross-genre work. So my first documentary had no interviews, it had reenactments, it had voiceover, it had animation. So a lot of my work, and certainly the work that is best known, is unusual in its form. So to say documentary, to my view, in some ways everything I've done is documentary, and even the few fiction only or dramatic works that I've done. One of them is called Parkdale. It's a fictionalized story, but it's really about my experience growing up in this inner city community of Toronto. And so it's a lot about that place, Parkdale, and what it's like. And it's also inspired by time I spent around a lot of kids in foster care. So it's very documentary. It's an approach because the story is so rooted in issues that I care about and I actually want to see changes. And so it has sort of an activist kind of feel to it as well. So in terms of my inspirations, I would say they range. I always want to make positive change or contribute to making positive change wherever I can. So whether, you know, things that I think about these days are foster care, what's happening to kids in foster care. I've been interested in that for a long time. The justice system and the over-incarceration of Indigenous people across the country. There's various political ends that I have with my work, and of course I'm also an artist. So, you know, formal experimentation, things that are beautiful, things that move you, things that are poignant. More and more I'm working with, I would say, kind of elemental ideas in my work, sort of like dirt, rain, very kind of simple but sort of really narrowing things down and making them very metaphorical for bigger issues. And so I'm becoming a bit more abstract in some respects, but it's always tied to our concrete world. So I'm working on an installation right now that's a multimedia installation. I'm also working on a virtual reality piece that's set in a future state. That's kind of interesting, as well as working on a documentary. So I kind of do a lot of work, and some of it's more mainstream and it will play on television, and it reaches a really broad audience because I want to reach not just artistic folks but lots of folks, and other things I know will be more limited. For example, working in a virtual reality piece, you can't show it to a lot of people. So I tend to swim between different formats and expressions. And almost every time I do something like this, I will tend to do something that's quite different as the next one. So I kind of am always doing something new and doing something different from what I did the last time. So documentary film festivals, I think, are really important. I mean, it's amazing to me and great that in the last 10 years or so, how much audience has been drawn to documentary film festivals. And I think this is really encouraging. And I think it probably reflects the fact that we live in a time where our journalism is less well supported, more suspect. You know, if there's owners that are right-wing, you might see certain type of stories. So there's a sense that we're not necessarily getting the big picture, and even if we are getting the news, people crave something more in depth that explains what's happening in the world, because it's fairly chaotic. And I think that the rise in documentary kind of reflects that. And I mean, I know that when I started in documentary filmmaking, most of the channels in Canada had one-off documentary strands. So what that meant was every week you could tune in, and I think CBC had two. They had Rough Cuts and they had another one, and they would, so twice a week you could see a documentary that someone had usually, you know, the one-off documentaries versus the series, people pour themselves into those films usually, and so the quality that you get from that kind of film making is amazing. Now, over the last, well, it's happened quite a while ago now, but about 10 years ago, there was a change in the CRTC regulations, and that was when they said that documentary would include reality shows and lifestyle, you know, homemaking series and stuff. So suddenly, the broadcasters all moved to that because it was cheaper, it got better ratings, and you saw almost immediately the disappearance of these outlets for one-off documentaries. So I think that the rise of interest in festivals also reflects that people want to see those films, so they go to them at festivals. And for me as a filmmaker, I find it, you know, I really like seeing the work at festivals, but connecting with your colleagues and discussing what you're doing is probably the most satisfying and most encouraging, because I think we all know that people don't make documentary films because of the fame or the fortune. So it can be a long haul, right? And if you're doing it for years and years, it's really good to have a community you connect with, to inspire you and to kind of share some of the struggles and artistic challenges with. So I think that's really important.